perspective of making sure that you've structured your licenses and your service agreements properly. And when you have a hybrid model of that nature, the key risk we have seen is in the area of support and maintenance. Because you would expect in a pure cloud computing environment, support and maintenance is extremely low because the applications are running totally on the vendor's hardware. But when you have a hybrid model, it's important that in your KPIs, in the service levels, you're clear that you would expect some degree of on-site support as well. Now, as obvious as that might seem when we talk to each other, again, these are the sort of areas I've seen a degree of failure from the legal side in terms of providing enough gravity on both remote service support and on-site service support. So in a hybrid situation, your KPIs will be much wider. Your obligations placed on the vendor in terms of support and maintenance will be a lot higher as well. The third area is besides support maintenance is installation and installation obligations. Again, what this means is someone has to put that content properly, install it, the applications properly onto the customer side. And because cloud tends to be a very remote exercise, I've seen situations where a lot of burden is placed on the customer to take care of all of the application they have to run on his side. I think that's a bad balance to strike. So if a cloud computing company wishes to provide traditional IT services and cloud services, it has to have enough back-end support players to be able to provide that support that customers require on-site. Others don't do it. That's a tough one. It's like, when you say you buy something from Microsoft, for example, and you try to argue over the Microsoft Word terms and conditions before you open the little flap and take out the CD. If a vendor chooses to treat his service as a shrink wrap arrangement, let's say, and says these are my standard terms, these are what all my customers accept, you have only one of two choices: one, to take his word and to accept it, or two, to look for another vendor. The plain fact is that a lot of people expect a fair bit in terms of flexibility in contracting. But for obvious commercial reasons, most vendors would prefer to treat their terms and conditions as standard terms and not allow any amendments. I think it's still very important for the end users to review that document and assess whether they can accept that level of legal risk. If they're going in on the basis of not being able to change the agreement, then they need to understand what are the risks that I'm going to face if I were to sign this agreement, and then take the necessary steps at their end to address those legal risks. So, for example, if it's a situation where it's an intellectual property ambiguity, then I think there's nothing you can do at your end to address that legal risk. Those have to be taken up clearly with the vendor so that you have sufficient understanding as to what the so-called right to use means. If there's insufficient clarity in terms of the flow-down terms from the individual applications that are installed at the vendor side, ask for those terms and conditions, because you are entitled to them as a user, clearly. So ask for them, and the vendor should provide them to you, because these are back-to-back agreements, and then you have the ability to make your own assessment as to whether you're getting enough rights or not. In terms of a network connectivity, if you have a vendor who uses as a standard term an exclusion of liability clause saying we will not be liable if our internet fails, that to me would be a death knell type clause. I think even with your brightest of eyes open, recognize that it means that there is a single point of failure. And if the vendors in IT systems are not robust enough, then you will have an issue. So if you cannot change those terms, do some due diligence on the vendor, find out what sort of backup telecom services they have in place. If they have a 2-layer or 3-layer redundancy plan in place, then perhaps the chance of telecom failure is low. So then you're able to assess the legal risk. But don't go in there blind. So read those documents that are given to you. As a layperson, you would understand at least about 60 to 70% of it. Maybe identify the risks as I've identified to you, and then see whether, if you can't change the terms, can you do due diligence on the vendor to find out what's the real risk in terms of internet connectivity, in terms of your intellectual property. If you have to do it internally, I think very much along the lines of the best practices that we've discussed earlier, make sure you adopt those best practices, your due diligence exercises. In addition to that, I suppose, in terms of strategy, is to make sure that you engage with every layer of the vendor. That means it's not enough to just treat a service level agreement risk assessment and review just by having the lawyers talking to the other set of lawyers. That's not enough. That's just one layer of the work. There has to be a clear communication between the commercial teams and the technical teams, between the organizations. And so those are the horizontal links. Then you must have the vertical links as well, meaning our internal legal must talk to the commercial, must talk to the technical. And only if we have that as a strategy will we be able to really assess legal risk. Without that open communication, you're going to have a very stilted review of your SLAs done by lawyers who have no idea about what the commercial or technical realities are. And for the reasons I've explained earlier, you will not then have a contract that's balanced. You can end up in a situation where you're overcompensating in your contract. As I mentioned to you, if the question is one of excluding liability for internet, a lawyer would strike it out, saying not acceptable, legal risk too high. But if he had talked to his technical people and they told him, well, these guys have got 2-3 layers of redundancy, so I think it's an acceptable level of risk, then the lawyer can make a call and say, fine, we'll take that off, or use that clause perhaps for negotiation purposes with the other side, but with a view to accepting the clause eventually, because the legal risk is acceptable. If you don't do that, then you're basically carrying out a very superficial review exercise of a IT contract.